Right, okay, good morning, everybody. We will make a start. I know there's one or two that will be joining us, but after we've done the introductions, we'll be able to move forward and carry on. For those I've not met before, my name's Paul Coleman. I'm the Chief Executive of South Cheshire Chamber of Commerce, and I'm really delighted to see so many people on this webinar this morning, albeit I can't actually see you all, but I know you're there, so I hope you're all well. And for those of you who are reopening your premises on the 17th, may I, first of all, wish you all the luck and best wishes that it opens up smoothly. Today we are joined by Rhino Safety and Poole Alcock, who will be covering how to securely return to the workplaces after lockdown has finished. Kate Walter from Rhino Safety will be covering the current requirements and how to manage the ongoing risks of staff returning to work in the COVID-19 era. Following on from Kate's presentation, we've got Jamie Risley from Poole Alcock, who will be covering what we can do from an employment law perspective to prepare for reopening and how we can support and manage our people back into the workplace, which I know is extremely important and a hot topic at the moment. So both speakers are open to questions. If you have any questions throughout the talks, please post them in the Q&A tab. You'll find that at the bottom of the screen. And we will answer these following the two presentations. Should we not be able to get to all the questions that are asked, then we'll make sure that we'll respond to you personally and give you that information. So that's all from me, really. And I'd like to now hand over to Kate Walter, firstly. So thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar this morning. I hope that you find it useful. I'd just like to reiterate Paul's best wishes for all those of you who are either currently reopening in the midst of or about to reopen in the next few weeks. I know that it's a very uncertain time for people, and hopefully that the information that we'll be providing you with today will help to reassure you and give you some confidence in the measures that you need to be taking to make sure that you are reopening safely and compliantly in this ongoing COVID era. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce a little bit about where we're the starting point at the moment. We've obviously been living with COVID now for around about 14 months, and it's obviously had a lot of impact on the way workplaces have operated. What we're seeing now is that obviously there is definitely increased optimism for people getting back to normal, back to business, back on with their lives, as we're seeing the number of cases of COVID starting to decrease. There are fewer deaths, and obviously increasing numbers of the population are vaccinated. So there's definitely optimism around. But what I would say is that we need to proceed with caution when we're talking about workplace safety, because there is very clear scientific evidence that COVID is not going to go away at any point. We are going to move from a pandemic situation to an endemic situation, which means that essentially we are likely to permanently live with COVID as being part of the population globally. So what we actually need to be looking at now is how we manage that as opposed to avoiding it, which has essentially been what the kind of strategy has been over the last 14 months, has been avoidance through lockdowns, working from home and things like that. There is clearly an ongoing obligation in terms of health and safety management to minimise the risk of COVID transmission in the workplace. And that obligation isn't going to go away anytime soon. Although COVID is likely, as I say, to become endemic, and we will learn to live with it in the same way as we do things like the flu, at the moment, there is still an obligation on employers to ensure that their workplaces are not putting their staff and their workforce at unnecessary risk of COVID transmission. Now, obviously, I would hope that you're all aware that there are certain statutory things you need to have in place, certain statutory documentation. So, for instance, you need to have a specific COVID-19 risk assessment in place. That's not new. That's been in place since April, May last year, so for about 12 months now. And that risk assessment, as I say, should be very specific to COVID-19 and minimising that risk of transmission in the workplace. I'm not going to focus too much on the detail of that today, because as I say, that's not a new measure that needs to be in place. That's something you should already have in place. If by any chance anybody hasn't, or you're not sure whether or not yours is effective, please do let us know, because that's something that we can help you with moving forward. And just a side note there as well, please do remember that all risk assessments are working documents. This isn't something that you should have written once 12 months ago and then you leave on a shelf in a dusty lever arch file. It's a working document, so you should be reviewing and updating that regularly. And likewise, you may also need to consider writing new COVID specific risk assessments for people who become at an increased risk, who weren't necessarily at the beginning of all of this. So for instance, if you have an employee who becomes pregnant, you need to consider that within the kind of whole overarching umbrella of COVID risk assessments as well. But what I'd like to really focus on today is the sorts of measures that you need to be taking to make sure that your workplace is safe and compliant, looking now at this kind of new era of reopening and attempting to get back to some sort of normality. Over the past year, there's obviously been a lot of businesses who have managed to very successfully have employees working from home and working remotely using technology like this that we've got today. But we are now seeing lots of businesses who are trying to get their employees back into the workplace on a more permanent footing. So without the threat of hopefully further lockdowns, although that is something that you'd still need to consider potentially seasonally. There is potential for further lockdowns, we've heard, over the autumn and winter seasons. They are much likely to be local rather than national though. But what we're focusing on today is those things that you need to look at to make sure that your workplace is really completely ready to be safe for people returning to work on a more permanent basis. So I'm going to start off now talking about some of the kind of infrastructure things that you might need to check and really make sure that you've got those things compliant and safe for employees to return to. So the sorts of things that I'm talking about here are within your actual office premises, things that may have been either shut down completely for a long period of time, or perhaps they haven't had the usual focus of normal health and safety checks and measures over the last 12 months. So you might need to look at those in some details. So for your kind of low risk office type premises, the sorts of things that you need to be checking are things like your pat testing of electrical equipment. It's quite possible that during the past 14 months, the usual checks and tests that may have taken place on things like electrical equipment, fire extinguishers, your fixed electrical testing, fire alarms, any smoke alarm systems, things like that, that could well have been missed over the last 14 months. So you need to go through a kind of checklist process of making sure that your actual infrastructure is all up to date, safe and compliant. With more kind of medium to high risk premises, where you're talking about, you may have automated machinery, forklift trucks, air conditioning units, things like that. There are various different things that, again, over the course of the last 14 months, the usual checks and balances and measures that may have taken place usually may not have happened. So things like looking at automated machinery, does that need to be recalibrated? Are there any automated moving parts where there may have been rust or corrosion buildup and be at a greater risk of seizure? All those sorts of things that previously may have been checked on a very regular basis, either monthly or weekly, that may not have been happening. So it is worth kind of almost viewing your premises as needing a full spring clean from a health and safety perspective, just to make sure that everything is in the correct working order, that it's up to speed, and that any kind of obligatory tests and measures that need to take place have actually happened, and if they haven't, making sure that they are booked in for as soon as possible. Certainly with those kind of medium to higher risk kind of examples that I gave, you really shouldn't be putting people in a situation where they're using that kind of machinery without those tests and inspections having taken place. On top of that, there are also some kind of lower level things that you need to check that, again, is the sort of thing that you might not necessarily consider on a daily basis, but is worth checking now. So, for instance, Legionella risk for hot and cold water systems, air conditioning units, any pressure systems for things like steam boilers in the kitchen, all those sorts of things should be checked. Certainly with the Legionella risk, it's worth getting your whoever provides your Legionella testing to make sure that any biocides are still active in the systems, and make sure that hasn't kind of decreased efficiency because of a lack of use over the last 12 months. Moving on from those kind of things, there is obviously an ongoing obligation with regards to your enhanced cleaning and sanitisation measures. So this is something that, as I say, really should have already been in place since the COVID-19 secure legislation and guidance came into place last April. But although we are looking at reopening, that does not mean that there is a reduced obligation in those aspects. So things like your enhanced cleaning of high touch points, so stair banisters, door handles, taps, all that sort of thing, light switches, you should still have those enhanced cleaning measures in place, documented and recorded to make sure that they are still happening. Likewise, the obligation to still have hand sanitisation facilities, that is all still going to remain in place. There is no indication at this point in time that there is any kind of reduction in those obligations at the moment, despite reopening and the sort of loosening of restrictions that we're seeing in other areas. That also extends to the fact that if you have already implemented measures over and above what is in that COVID-19 secure guidance, you should still continue to monitor that, implement it where you feel necessary, and that's guided by your own risk assessments, until you get to a point where on review you decide such measures aren't necessary. So the sort of thing that I'm talking about here, as an example, we've noticed that some businesses, particularly offices where potentially social distancing isn't particularly easy to implement, there are businesses who have implemented the wearing face masks inside in either communal areas or when walking around the office, albeit staff haven't been obliged to wear face masks while sat at their desk. That isn't something that is required by the guidance and legislation, but if it's something that you implemented as a result of your own risk assessment in your business, it isn't as simple as, right, well, the restrictions are being loosened, so you don't need to do that anymore. That the idea of taking away that requirement within your premises should be based on a review of your risk assessment and deciding that that risk element is no longer necessary. So make sure, as I say, that you are continually reviewing and renewing that documentation and risk assessment process. Moving on then, another factor to consider is the kind of human factor, the people element of how you are protecting your staff in the workplace, rather than looking at the kind of the mechanics of the premises itself. So a huge part of reintroducing people back into the workplace needs to be looking at how long they have been away for. If you are looking at people returning to the workplace who have either been working from home or potentially furloughed or flexi-furloughed over the last 14 months, it would be a really good idea to consider a reinduction to the workplace for those staff, especially if you have done things like changing systems, processes, or even layouts in your office. You cannot expect those people to return to the office and just pick up as normal. So it's definitely a good idea to consider implementing a reinduction program for those members of staff to make sure that they are aware of what your new systems and processes are. We've been talking to a lot of clients who have talked about people potentially not complying with the rules and processes that they put into place. And when we've actually delved deeper into that situation, it's been that the staff haven't known that there are new processes in place. An example of that is a company where they had introduced a one-way system around their office. People were ignoring it simply because they didn't know it was in place. They hadn't had that information communicated to them well enough. So please do make sure that you are communicating all of the changes that you've made, the requirements that you require your staff to comply with, and make sure you have that documented and recorded, and that they have acknowledged receipt of that information, so that you can show that you are not only putting those processes into place, but really making sure that your staff know what is required of them. Because as we all know, health and safety, there is dual obligation, there's mutual responsibility on the employee and the employer to protect each other, essentially. The other thing to really take very serious consideration to is any employees who have actually started employment with you during lockdown period and who have therefore never had a full induction into the property and premises that you're in. Although obviously things have been very difficult over this lockdown period, there are a lot of businesses who have actually either pivoted or done particularly well because of the particular industry they're in, who have taken on new staff who have only ever worked from home. Where that's the case, if you are now requiring them to come back into the workplace, even if they've been employed by you for a period of months, you need to treat them as though they were a brand new employee and make sure you go through that full usual health and safety induction process, and also taking into account the new COVID health and safety measures that you have in place as well. So make sure that you don't forget about those employees who maybe are just not familiar with your premises whatsoever. Another element related to the people aspect of returning to work is to think about the qualifications and potential skills atrophy that people will be experiencing through having been away from the workplace for an extended period of time. So in much the same way as if you had an employee on a period of parental leave or potentially long-term sickness absence, that you would look at their skills and qualifications upon return to the workplace, you should do the same thing now with those employees returning to the workplace after a period of working from home or furlough. So for instance, you may have employees who had first aid qualifications or fire safety qualifications such as fire marshals or other safety related training that has expired during the last 14 months. Now, a quick note here, for first aid certification specifically, anyone whose qualification was due to expire prior to October the 31st, 2020, that qualification was extended for a period of 6 months. That means that all of those qualifications therefore fully expired on March 31st, 2021. So it's really important that you go through the process of conducting a skills and qualifications audit with your staff, and anyone whose qualifications have expired, you need to get those qualifications refreshed as a matter of urgency. You really do need to consider the number of, particularly in relation to first aid, the number of first aiders that you require to have in your premises, and whether or not you have got enough qualified people, particularly if you are then covering any staff absences. We need to be very aware of the fact that self-isolation is still required where people have been in contact or have obviously got COVID-19, and therefore you need to make sure that you've got enough staff to cover first aid requirements if that happens. And finally, I just want to touch on the mental health aspect of people returning to the workplace. People often talk about health and safety and forget that actually what we're really talking about is health, safety and welfare. And mental health is a huge aspect of the health and safety and welfare obligations that employers have to their employees. So you need to be very aware of the potential mental ill health aspects that you may come across with people returning to the workplace. And there are various different factors to consider. This isn't just a case of people being worried about coming back to work. Please don't fall into the trap of diminishing the kinds of mental ill health that people may be experiencing at this time. To break it down into a few factors, things that you should be particularly conscious of being on the lookout for are things like depression related to long periods of inactivity and isolation that people may have been experiencing. You may need to be on the lookout for anxiety related illnesses, particularly in relation to people who are anxious about returning to enclosed areas with potentially large numbers of people which they have not been exposed to over the last 14 months. There may be people experiencing grief, either because of the loss of loved ones due to COVID, or because of serious trauma that they've been exposed to with, for instance, serious complications to people suffering from COVID, the long COVID symptoms that we're now seeing. And finally, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence at the moment that there are people experiencing PTSD type symptoms in relation to the whole pandemic. So it's really important as an employer that you are aware of these kind of symptoms that people may be experiencing. We've talked to clients who are asking questions about what do we do if people are refusing to return to work or are very reluctant to return to work. And I know that Jamie will be touching on that in his talk following mine. But it's not just a HR issue. This is a health, safety and welfare issue as well. And you do have an obligation to make sure that you are supporting your employees appropriately. And in that, we have to recognise that most employers are not qualified in mental health issues at all. So one thing that I would strongly encourage all employers to consider is not only do you need to think about your first aid staff in terms of the physical first aid, but it's also worth considering having mental health first aid workers as well. With our training courses, we have mental health first aid qualifications that people can take either from an awareness perspective or actually as a practitioner of mental health first aid. And it's something that I think we're going to see a huge increase. There is no obligation from a legislative standpoint at the moment for employers to provide mental health first aiders, but I can see that that is something that probably will come in the future. And it's something that I would, like I say, strongly recommend that you consider putting into place now, so that you are in a position to recognise when people are struggling and implement the support that those people may need. That's it for what I'm going to cover now, so I will hand back over. But obviously, if anything that I've mentioned raises further questions for you, or you want more information about the sorts of training courses that we can provide to assist in returning your workforce to the workplace safely, then obviously please do get in touch.
Well, thank you, Kate, for that information. You packed a lot in there, really, and there's a lot for people to take in. So thank you for that offer to sort of continue that contact. Obviously, hopefully you've got some questions that you might want to ask at the end. Don't forget, I think Dom's reminded everybody that if you want to write a question in the question and answers section, please do, and we will answer that at the end after Jamie's presentation. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jamie from Poole Alcock, who will be covering how to prepare reopening from a law perspective. So over to you, Jamie.
Hi, thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. And thanks to Kate as well. I think that was really, really helpful. And hopefully, if anyone's got any questions, they can obviously share those at the end. So in terms of what I'm going to discuss, I thought it would be helpful to run through some of the main employment law considerations for people to bear in mind when they are bringing people back to the workplace. Inevitably, there's going to be other considerations, but I think given the time constraints, I've limited it to 5 key areas. So first one is bringing people back from furlough. Supporting people with childcare or other caring responsibilities, vaccinations, that's been a big one in the media at the moment, testing in the workplace, and then dealing with those employees that are reluctant to return to work. Inevitably, though, one of the first points for most employers will be to make a decision about whether or not they should actually be returned to the workplace. We do obviously need to bear in mind that current government guidance says that employees should be supported to work from home wherever possible, and that guidance is not expected to change until at least the 21st of June, until we get to step 4 of the lockdown roadmap. So that obviously leaves employers with two options. One is to support working from home until the lockdown restrictions or social distancing is relaxed, or to facilitate a return to the workplace in line with COVID secure workplace guidance, where working from home is not possible. So with this in mind, it's ideal to be asking yourself three essential questions. One, is it necessary? Two, is it sufficiently safe? Obviously, Kate's give a really helpful run through of how you can do that. And then three, it's really important that it's mutually agreed as well. Okay. In terms of bringing people back from furlough, the act of furloughing or unfurloughing was something that had been never heard of. I don't mind admitting myself that I'd never heard of the word furlough before March last year. So there was no, aside from current government guidance that has obviously been adapted, there's been no specific legislation or precedent of how to deal with that or how to administer it. In terms of the legal obligations, well, what we've had to rely on is like ongoing and pre-existing legal guidance and obligations that employers are under anyway. So when we look at that, bearing in mind the Equality Act 2010, so that protects people with certain protected characteristics from being discriminated against. And we also need to bear in mind the Employment Rights Act, which protects people from being unfairly or constructively dismissed as well, and from suffering detriments. Well, obviously we'll touch on that as we proceed. When we're looking at unfurloughing staff, it's important that a strategy is determined, and having a strategy will enable you to ensure that that process is carried out fairly and objectively. And it will obviously be a documented thought process that you can rely on if that was ever subject to scrutiny. So who do you unfurlough and how? So here are some thoughts from myself. So the first, I suppose, the option that you could consider is to consider what skills and experience is needed in order to drive the business forward. So with that in mind, it might be a selection process similar to what you would carry out in a redundancy situation, but a selection process to give precedent to those skills and experience that you really need to drive the business forward as we move away from lockdown restrictions. You could also look at the business needs. It's sort of related, but look at which departments do you need back before other departments. Look at your pipeline, look at your business plans. What's the business needs in order to bring those people back? Another option is to consider volunteers as well. Now, you may have some employees that are somewhat reluctant to put themselves forward, which again we'll touch on shortly. And you may also get, on the other hand, more volunteers than you're expecting, which you then might need to go through a selection process in any event. So it's better to have that ready and ready to be implemented if you need to rely on it. You could also consider personal circumstances as well, but with that, I would be mindful to not use discriminatory criteria. So for example, it might be that you have a certain member of staff that is struggling with childcare. That is a perfectly legitimate reason for still using the furlough scheme. However, what would be discriminatory is to keep all female members of staff on furlough because of the assumption that they're all going to have childcare issues. If you've got a disabled member of staff that has certain health and safety concerns, then again, it might be appropriate to keep them on furlough. But having a blanket restriction that all members of staff with disabilities are to be kept on furlough is more than likely potentially discriminatory. It's also important to remember that it's bound to be an anxious time for employees returning to the workplace, particularly for those that have been absent for a long period of time. So to ensure you're doing the best by your staff, I've put a list of considerations for employers to consider. So the first one is to make meaningful contact in advance of the workday. So you need to notify them that they are expected to return, and you can iron out any issues at that stage. So that should be ideally by telephone or video call. And they've been really helpful over the last 14 months. But I'd use it as an opportunity to catch up with the employee, answer any questions that they may have, update them on what's been happening at work, update them in relation to changes that have taken place. As Kate said earlier, there'll be lots of changes to the workplace, more than likely. And it's an opportunity to check in with them and make sure that they feel at ease returning. It's also an important step of the process, particularly if communication has been general or sporadic. Communicate changes in flexible working, flexible furlough. Do you need to review the hours of work? Do you need to implement any plans that they may be required for them to fully return? You also, as Kate said earlier, you need to supply a copy of the COVID risk assessment. So again, this should be in advance of their return to work. And again, as Kate alluded to earlier, it is important this is a working document and it is updated as necessary. It's also important to bear in mind that certain employees may be at higher risk than others. So do you need individual COVID risk assessments in those circumstances? Again, as Kate said earlier, is there any training needed or any refresher training that's needed to enable them to return to work, especially bearing in mind those that have been out of the workplace for a considerable amount of time? Do you need to update systems and relevant third parties? So do payroll need to be updated? Health and safety support, do they need to be updated? Make sure they can obviously access the system when they return, and make sure everything is in place to facilitate that return to the workplace. Another important thing to mention is to ensure that any records are updated and that they are maintained. That's particularly important because no one wants to be on the receiving end of the new government furlough fraud squad that has just been implemented. It's not called furlough fraud squad, but I think the acronym is quite apt. Again, it's important to remember that the current guidance is to work from home wherever possible. However, with the stay-at-home order lifted as of the 29th of March, employees may wish to open up their offices in a limited way for those that might be struggling with either home working because of their mental health or because their working environment is unsuitable. So there is that flexibility in order to facilitate that. But again, it's important that we bear in mind the current government guidance. The next topic I wanted to talk to you about is in relation to supporting employees without the childcare or other caring responsibilities. So over the last 14 months, employers have had to demonstrate that flexibility to support those working parents or those with caring responsibilities. That's going to continue. Employers are still expected to have that flexibility when managing their people and consider all the options of support available. Arguably, childcare has become less of an issue as the schools have reopened, but it's still something that employees should certainly be alive to, especially with the holidays around the corner. So what are the options available under those circumstances? Well, we've still got the furlough scheme that's been extended until the 30th of September, and the level of grant available to employers will stay the same until the end of June, at which point it will be tapered out till it closes. The scheme rules specifically say that can be used by working parents if, because of COVID-19, the employee childcare needs have been impacted, such as homeschooling, closure of settings, for example. And it's also important to remember that whilst that is available to employers, it's important to remember that an employer is not compelled to accept a request from the employee under those circumstances. The decision does rest with the individual employer taking into account the business needs. The other option is in relation to flexible working. So flexible working is, in my view, probably going to be one of the biggest areas for the upcoming 12 months. The statutory right for flexible working has existed since around 2003. The statutory provisions state that employees are entitled to submit a request for flexible working, and that request must be considered by an employer. So the request doesn't necessarily have to be accepted, providing there's sound business reasons for that. And that's available to not only employees with childcare or other caring responsibilities, it's open to all employees with over 26 weeks continuous service. And again, that's the current legal position, but there's already been talks of that changing, whether it be flexible working from day one, so the removal of the 26 weeks criteria, or to make flexible working the default position, and then employees having to articulate the reasons why that should not be the default setting. Again, as I said, in light of the generally successful working from home, I can speak for myself that I think it's worked out quite well. Obviously, it won't be the case for everyone. I think it's going to be much more difficult for employees to articulate those business reasons as to refusing those requests. So I think that's something that the employees also need to be mindful of. And in any event, it's important to remember that businesses do need to be a bit more flexible, be more agile in its recovery from COVID-19. So implementing flexible working practices could prove beneficial. And employees can be creative with that. It's not just a case of part-time hours or part-time working. Consider condensed hours, homework and job sharing. Can you flex the start time, flex the end time? Can you stagger the working hours? There's other ways that employers can implement those flexible working practices to enable those members of staff with those struggles to return to the workplace. Parental leave as well. So employees with over 1 year's continuous service have a statutory right to apply for unpaid parental leave. Now, the entitlement's for a maximum of 4 weeks, and that needs to be taken in 1 or 2 week blocks. And they must provide at least 21 days notice. It is unpaid, but it is still an option for employees to consider, and some employees may have to rely on that. Again, it's important to be as flexible as possible. So whilst there is the requirement for, say, the 21 days notice, is it possible for employees to negotiate that? Can they be a bit more flexible in relation to the timescales? Annual leave. So employees still obviously have their annual leave allowance, and that will obviously still be an option for certain individuals. Clearly, that can only be for a defined period, because it's important to keep some of that annual leave aside for them to use throughout the holiday year. So from a health and safety and working time regulation perspective, it's a requirement for employees to have rest break from work. So if they're using all that rest break in one go at the beginning of the year, then arguably that goes against the working time regulations. Unpaid leave. So can a period of unpaid leave give the employee time to provide the care that they need to provide, or to find alternative arrangements? That's certainly an option. Time off, it depends as well. I think we also need to be live to that. So all employees, so regardless of the length of service, have a statutory right to take reasonable unpaid time off work to take the necessary and unexpected care for a dependent. Now, the time off is only for a reasonable period of time, and what is reasonable is not actually defined in the legislation, but in most cases it's going to be 1 or 2 days off work which will be sufficient to then enable the employee to find and make alternative arrangements. Further time off that might be required could then be covered by any of the other options that we've just been through. The next area I wanted to touch on is the COVID-19 vaccination. So again, this has been a hot topic in the news. I think Charlie Mullins of Pimlico Plumbers was one of the first ones to announce its no jab, no job policy. So there was lots of people that were applauding that stance, and then other people that were very cautious. The people that were very cautious are usually the employment solicitors. The government stance on this is also really important to bear in mind. So at the moment, the guidance says that it's up to businesses to decide what to do in those circumstances. So for some businesses, it might be appropriate, for others, it's not going to be, for obvious reasons. And again, it's a complex issue, and it can't simply be answered by a yes or no. So I'd love to be able to say that, yes, you can do that, it's fair, but obviously the circumstances to the individual organisation and the individuals that you're looking to implement it to will be really relevant. you need to have a strong justification for introducing a policy in the workplace. So if you're looking at making it mandatory rather than personal choice, then you need to make sure you've got that rationale to one side so you can rely on it if needed. Again, government guidance says that it's not compulsory, so we need to bear that in mind. Why is it important for you to have that strong justification? Well, because of the legal ramifications. So admittedly, that there's probably greater risks if you're looking to implement it to new starters than existing staff, but the issues are broadly the same. So first issue is potential discrimination claims. So if you take disciplinary action or other detrimental action, so reducing pay against an employee for refusing to have the vaccine, or if you reject a job applicant because they will not have the vaccine, if that reason is connected to a protected characteristic, so a philosophical or religious belief, or if it's due to a disability, then you are exposed to the risk of a claim for indirect discrimination. Claim for indirect discrimination arises where you apply a policy, condition, or practice that disadvantages a group of people who share that protected characteristic, and that policy, condition, or practice is not objectively justifiable. So that's why, as we've just mentioned, if you are going to consider implementing a mandatory vaccine policy, you must be confident that you can demonstrate that strong justification. Also consider less intrusive alternatives as well. So employee screening, for example, can you ask employees to declare that they haven't had COVID-19, or they're not exposed, or they're not suffering any issues with having any symptoms? Can you take temperature checked for employees? That's all something that you would need to consider. In relation to any detrimental treatment as well, so you would also need to show that that process was fair before dismissing that employee. So as you would expect, there's been no cases on this yet, but factors that are likely to be relevant will be whether or not what the employee's reason for refusing that vaccine was, the nature of the employee's role as well, and whether there are any other options available to reduce the risk of infection as well. I'd probably say the employee's role is going to be the most important factor. So, for example, in social care sectors, it's going to be more easily justified than it would be for an employment solicitor, for example, who can quite easily work from home. And again, there's the health and safety considerations, which Kate really helpfully went through earlier. I also having a lot of questions from employees asking whether or not they can encourage staff to have the vaccination. Well, I can answer that one with a yes, but I will caveat it that as long as you approach it carefully, and you need to be sensitive to any objections made by the employee as well, and to ensure that that encouragement doesn't turn into pressure, which would then give rise to potential claims. So in relation to workplace testing then, so again, this will be a hot topic as we start to reintegrate back into the workplaces. We're all aware of the basic hands, face, space motto the government is so fond of, but some employers, to ensure the safety of employees, they may be considering using the lateral flow tests, which can be obtained from the government in order to help reopen the workplace or enhance the safety measures already in place. So the starting point for that as well is to understand the testing itself. So it's, again, important to remember that it's not mandatory. So that means that you will require your employee to agree to it. So consent will be really important in relation to this as well. Again, it's arguable that testing could be mandatory for some employees. So those that work in settings with close interaction with vulnerable individuals who would be deemed to be high risk. There's several considerations in this respect, so I'll go through those. So where will the testing be done? So you need to consider whether you're going to ask employees to take the tests at home and then share the results, register and input the results themselves, or if you're going to set up a testing site on the premises. In my view, the first option is probably more manageable, and that would mitigate some of the data protection considerations. Not all of them, granted, but certainly some of them, as you'd only be processing the results of the test. Further, employees may find this approach less intrusive, as they can undertake a test themselves in the comfort of their own home. And it's part of that moral conditioning that we've all been used to as well over the last 14 months. Again, hands, face, space, protect the NHS. I think there's been definitely a sense of moral condition that we've all been exposed to try and do what we can to help each other. And if they are doing them in the comfort of their own home, then that might give them that sense of that they're doing their bit to help out. Communication. So again, as a theme, again, this will be a really important factor. So given that you'll need consent, it's important that you communicate with them and you allow them to understand the reasons for the testing, why you feel it's required, how the testing will be done and how the results will be obtained, how much they'll be paid as well. So again, that's likely to be a big concern for employees. They need to give that certainly some consideration. At present, an employee who is required to self-isolate can claim statutory sick pay from the first day. So the 3 days waiting days have been waived by the coronavirus legislation. But if the company has a contractual company sick pay scheme, then I recommend that you stick to that unless you've got a good cause not to. If you aren't looking to pay company sick pay, then I definitely seek advice before you do that. The other point, so I have already touched on it, is in relation to the data protection issues. So the UK GDPR legislation allows employers to carry out health testing that is permitted under the legislation where there is good reason. However, so medical data is classed as special data, special category data, and therefore will require additional protection. So it's important that you complete a data protection impact assessment in order to ensure that you are compliant in the way that you are processing that data. So again, it's important to inform the members of staff of what personal data will be required, what it will be used for, who it will be shared with, and how long it will be kept, and what decisions you are going to be making based on that data that you're collecting. Another factor into that decision-making process is whether or not you'll require visitors to undertake testing before they enter the premises. So obviously, if it's a business which is open to the public, then that's not going to be possible and unlikely to cause conflict with individual employees. But in closed office environments, it might be more appropriate, more reasonable under those circumstances. Again, consider it carefully, as if you do not ask individuals who attend the site to take a test, you could be undermining your argument to have the test in the first place. If employees refuse to consent, then discuss those concerns with the employee, look at why they can't agree to take the test and look at alternatives to it. If discussion and compromise can't resolve the issue, then disciplinary action could potentially arise, but I'd strongly recommend that you run that by a HR or employment advisor before you look into take that route, because there are risks involved. So the last point I wanted to run through is dealing with employees who are refusing to return. Now, in this respect, I thought it'd be helpful to just run through the legal considerations. So again, as Kate said at the beginning, we've got the management of health and safety at work. So that requires businesses to make suitable and sufficient assessment of risks to an employee's health and safety and welfare. And again, it'll be necessary to revisit those risk assessments on an ongoing basis when an employee is refusing to return. Look at the reasons why they are reluctant to do so, what other additional measures can be put in place to alleviate those concerns. Again, under the Employment Rights Act, so employees are protected when acting to protect their own or others' safety. So an employee has a right to not be subject to a detriment or to be unfairly dismissed where they reasonably believe the danger to be so serious and imminent and chose not to return to work on that basis. That's going to be also extended to workers as well. So it's not just employees that will apply to, that's going to be extended to workers at the end of this month. So again, that's certainly something that we are expected to see an increase in potential claims. This one has been really interesting because when it was originally implemented, I think it was designed to sort of protect minors who might be exposed to risks when obviously they're going down in the mines. Now it's sort of been, we've sort of been using it to deal with the risks arising from COVID. So that's certainly imminent risk. So clearly that exposes employees to potential litigation. What is also important to remember is that it's not necessarily important what the employer reasonably believed. It's the employee's perception of that risk and how they feel about it, and providing they believe it to be serious and imminent. Unlike general dismissal claims, employees who bring a claim for detriment claims under relating to health and safety legislation, then they won't need the usual 2-year service to bring those claims. So they're what we call automatic unfair dismissal claims. There's also the whistleblowing legislation. So employees are protected if they raise protected disclosures. So again, that's certainly something that employees should be mindful of. So they'll be protected from dismissal, selection for redundancy, for example, or they shouldn't be subject to a detriment, like a disciplinary process, if they raise those whistleblowing concerns. Could also be a reduction in pay, for example. We have already covered the discrimination claims, but I think it's worthwhile pointing them out again. So those who are most likely to be reluctant to return to the workplace will probably be those that are deemed to be within the vulnerable categories, or those that have pre-existing medical conditions. Now, where there are underlying medical conditions, it's likely that the definition of a disability under the Equality Act is met. So that's a physical or mental impairment that has a long-term adverse impact on a person's day-to-day activities. And again, if there are underlying health conditions, then it's likely that definition is going to be satisfied. That then triggers an additional duty on employees to make reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments will obviously be specific to that individual, but again, it could include the issues that we mentioned earlier and that Kate mentioned in her presentation as well. What do you do if the employees are still refusing to work after you've discussed the concerns with them, looked at ways that you can alleviate those concerns, and you've explored all other options available? So if you are unable to reinsure the employee and you firmly believe that you've completed a thorough risk assessment and that the workplace is safe, I'd probably suggest a reasonable period of time for leave, or allow them to take annual leave, or any of those are the points that we raised at the beginning. That would be seen as a tribunal as sort of taking a middle ground. Whether the leave is paid or unpaid, again, it's a grey area legally, so I would advise you to make a commercial decision on that point. We won't have a definite position on pay until it's tested in the courts. Given the current backlogs, that's likely to be around 18 months. In addition, I think it's also important to remember that there might be historic issues that hadn't quite been sorted before we went into lockdown. So those might resurface, and the other issues with the handling of the process to the return to work exposes the employer to further litigation risks in that respect as well. I will finish up because I've just seen the message. I hope you found that helpful. Clearly there was a lot to run through. If you have any questions, then obviously feel free to ask, or if you wanted to contact me directly, then again, feel free to do so.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Yeah, no, very, very informative. As with this, there's a lot of information. We probably need a couple of hours really to cover it, but we're all got things that we'll need to carry on and do in business. So thank you for that, Jamie. We have had a number of questions in, so if I will ask each question, and if we can try and keep to the point as best as possible. I know that's not always easy. There's some complex questions that have come through, so I'll start as they've come in, and I think the first one's for Kate, really. What recommendations does Kate have for those businesses that operate from premises with shared facilities where perhaps the landlord is not as attuned to the COVID requirements as the tenant? How does the tenant business ensure that they are compliant from both a regulatory and staff well-being point of view if there are areas outside of their control?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that is very relevant, actually, because we ourselves are in a shared office building, and as a health and safety consultancy, as you can imagine, we're very up on what needs to be done, and we actually had to have conversations with our own landlord over this. So it's actually quite clear in terms of the lines of responsibilities and obligations. So you as the employer need to make sure that everything within your own part of that building, that you are doing everything you can to put the correct safety measures into place and be compliant within, essentially behind your own door. So you need to make sure that you've done everything within that office or whatever your premise is, to keep your staff safe. Your landlord then has their own obligations and responsibilities for the communal areas. Now, obviously, as a tenant, there is very little that you can do to compel your landlord to put those measures into place. You can obviously have conversations. And what we actually did was we made sure that our staff knew that we were having those conversations with our landlord, because we actually weren't satisfied with the enhanced cleaning measures that were taking place, or not, as the case may be. So we made sure that we had full communication. We have a team Rhino email that everybody is linked to. So we made sure that we communicated via that to our staff, that we were in conversations with the landlord and trying to make sure that the communal areas were being dealt with appropriately. What I would say is that you may have a landlord who is simply not open to those conversations, and there isn't a huge amount that you can do about that other than reassuring your staff that you are in those communications and making sure that your own part of the building is safe and compliant. Something that is worth noting is that the HSE have resumed on-site inspections. And we know for a fact that they are increasing COVID inspections. So they are absolutely going around premises and doing spot checks on the COVID measures that you have in place. It's definitely worthwhile communicating that information to your landlord, which may seem slightly passive aggressive, but it can be a useful tool to have in your arsenal. You should also bear in mind that you absolutely are entitled to phone the HSE and request an inspection and explain the issues that you're having. It's definitely worth considering that if there are serious concerns about the measures that are or are not being put in place by your landlord, because when it comes to the sorts of claims that can be made that Jamie has obviously touched upon, it's worth obviously being aware of the fact that your landlord would be, in this case, prosecuted, because health and safety is obviously under criminal law. It is the landlord that would be prosecuted if those responsibilities and obligations were falling short, not you as the tenant. So you can absolutely make sure that you're doing everything in your power to keep your staff safe, and communicate that you are trying to compel the landlord to do whatever they can. If you are hitting your head against a brick wall with your landlord, then I would definitely recommend speaking to firstly your kind of local authority contacts, but then if necessary you can go directly to the HSE and request an inspection.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. Very useful. Okay, moving on. One for Jamie, I think. Hi, due to change in business requirements, i.e. change of days stroke hours, that we are open and will be open in the future, I have 2 members of staff that I need to reduce hours by 2 hours and 4 hours per week. They are currently furloughed for these hours. What are my options going forward?
Well, again, I mean, the furlough scheme is still there to be used until it's closed to the end of September. So you still keep them on a flexible furlough arrangement. Moving forwards, moving past that, you can still have those arrangements. So just because we've not got the scheme, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have those arrangements with the individual employees directly. If we are looking at changing terms and conditions, then I think it's important that we remember that we need employees to consent to those changes. If they don't consent to those changes, then again, it exposes the organisation to risk in that respect. So when we're looking at risk, the options, if the employee doesn't agree to that, is to look at the fire and rehire tactic that again is currently in the news at the moment, because there's a current government consultation on whether or not that is actually lawful. The government has been keen to emphasise that they are somewhat reluctant to interfere, because it is up to businesses to decide what is appropriate for their individual organisations. Another option is to look at, when we've changing the terms and conditions, so the fire and rehire, you go through a consultation, look at, explain the reasons why those changes need to take place. If you've advised the employee of all options and discuss the reasons why those are needed in the first place, and they still can't agree to that, then that could give rise to a dismissal for some other substantial reason. Again, it's important that you do seek advice on that point. I hope that generic overview has been quite helpful.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Jamie, and obviously somebody can contact you directly, keeping some of these questions obviously anonymous, and get in touch with you for some more detailed advice. That'd be fine. Thank you. A quick one here is, and I don't know if somebody will know the answer, but the organisation missed the government deadline to register the charity for free staff testing. Is there anything this person can do? Is it still able to register to get some of that free staff testing? Does anybody know? Okay, you're nodding. You just on mute.
Yeah. Yes, sorry. Yes, for a start off, the lateral flow tests are available at various centres. So as an employee, you don't actually have to register with the government scheme to get access to those. You can literally go along to the sites and pick them up. So you can distribute them that way for lateral flow testing. In terms of the PCT tests, I'm not 100% certain about that. So I'd need to look into that further. But certainly if you're talking about the lateral flow testing, you don't need to do that via the government scheme. You can just do that by going along to your local testing centre and requesting the lateral flow tests. So yeah, that's still accessible. You just have to bear in mind the factors that Jamie mentioned about whether or not you are requiring staff to test, or if it's something that you are offering as an option for them. So for instance, we've had access to the lateral flow tests that we have simply said to our staff, if you wish to take these, we have them available and we can distribute them to you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Kate. Very, very useful. Thank you. We've got another one here. Very interesting. This is one I think for Jamie. Many people working from home have pets, particularly dogs. Over the past 4 months, pets have become used to their owners at home 24/7. This question is based on an actual case where, when asked to return to work, an employee stated that he would rather not, as it would be unfair to his dog. While Stuart would expect this issue to be discussed to a mutually satisfactory conclusion, what rights, if any, does the employee have hearing in supporting his case if negotiations seem to be against him?
Well, I think the starting point to mention is that when you are looking at serious and imminent danger, it doesn't fall within that. In any event, that would only apply to other people, not pets, unfortunately, although I'm all for including them. Yeah. I think we need to have a discussion with that individual, stipulate the reasons why the return to work is needed. The pet cope's fine before lockdown. If it's a lockdown pet, then that's something they would have had to consider at the time of them buying it. So yeah, don't rule off any ongoing discussions. And if there is an ongoing refusal, then there is the potential to start those disciplinary proceedings. But again, explore all other options at the first instance.
So hopefully an agreement can be made to reintroduce the dog or do something, and then steps take further. Okay.
Flexible working. I've never heard of it for pets, but flexible working arrangement to accommodate the pet. Yeah, it'd certainly be the first one on my watch.
You have now. Okay. Would you be able to introduce a requirement for employees to declare any positive COVID-19 results that they have as part of their contracts of employment? So require them to declare the positive test if they have any.
Again, I think they should be anyway. They certainly shouldn't be going in the workplace if they're testing positive. I think that's an issue. Yeah, Kate.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, I don't think it necessarily needs to be part of the employment contract. It can actually form part of your risk assessment that employees would be required to declare a positive test. So regardless of whether or not you have that as part of your employment contract, because, bear in mind, most people won't have had anything written into their contracts prior to this pandemic. It wasn't something that we were kind of exposed to. Certainly as part of your risk assessment, you can require disclosure because of the serious and imminent risk that it poses to other employees.
Okay, thank you, Kate.
But it's communicating that risk assessment and sharing that and making sure that's updated on an ongoing basis. Again, as Kate said at the beginning, it's a working document, so make sure that's updated regularly.
Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. Okay. Final question. What happens if someone refuses to return to the workplace because they know that some colleagues have refused to have the vaccination?
Well, that's another interesting one. And I think we'd need to look into their justification on that basis would be that they are fearing serious or imminent harm. Now, I think what we need to do is have a meeting with that member of staff, again, discuss the concerns that they have, highlight as well that vaccination isn't mandatory as per government guidance, and look at ways that the employer has trying to avoid any potential risk for COVID. Look at the strategies they've put in place, the workplace measures. Again, share the risk assessment with them so they can. It's all about transparency. I think is the answer to that one. Be as transparent and communicate to the employee the ways that the employer and the steps that they've taken to alleviate those risks. If they're still refusing to attend work, then again, I think you need to explore the other options. Can a period of unpaid time leave be accommodated? Can the furlough scheme still be used?
Yeah, okay.
And I would add to that as well that it should be, again, come back to the risk assessment. Part of your risk assessment should cover the fact that we need to consider the fact that it's not just about people refusing to have vaccinations. There are people who are unable to be vaccinated for various reasons, whether that's medical or religious grounds, and the like. So part of your risk assessment should cover the fact that you will be dealing potentially with a mixture of vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals, and the measures that you will put into place to cover that. So an example of that would be that those individuals who are not vaccinated for any reason may be required to wear face masks in communal areas when other employees may not be required to do that. So they're the sorts of measures that you can consider including in your risk assessment, which would then kind of minimize those concerns of refusal to return to the workplace because of the unvaccinated individual. Those individuals will not necessarily pose a serious and imminent danger if you've put additional measures into place to protect them.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that information. We haven't had any further questions, but again, if any of the attendees have any questions they'd like to send in on the feedback form or questions, I'm sure we'll pass that on to Jamie and Kate to come back to you on it. So I'd like to thank Jamie and Kate this morning for your information and the knowledge you've given us today, and the help and support for those businesses that are looking to particularly reopen at this stage, but very useful information for any business really. This webinar has been recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel very shortly, so you'll be able to listen to it again if you missed a point or you need to watch it again. Dom will be sending an online feedback form regarding the events, and would appreciate that if you could take 2 or 3 minutes just to complete. We'd love to hear about what future events and webinars and types of topics that you would require or need that we as a chamber could cover, that you'd find very useful, because there's a good chance that lots of other businesses out there that would find that very useful too. And before signing off, because I'm conscious of the time, just a reminder that the Chamber is a government gateway for the Kickstart scheme, which is all about helping to provide placements for young adults in the workplace with funding and support from the government. If you'd like more information about the Kickstart scheme, then please email John Barnes, or again, send information to Dom through the feedback form. Excuse me. Our Q1 magazine is now live on issue, and will be delivered to members' premises very shortly. Dom will add also a link to the electronic version in the delegate pack when it finishes. And I must admit, it's a really pleased with the staff and what they've done with the magazine. It's a really excellent edition with lots of good information, and it looks really good. And we focus quite a bit on HS2. And so finally, some events that are coming up. How to maximise your chamber membership event is always great if you're looking to become a member, or you know somebody who could be interested in becoming a member, and how you yourself might be able to maximise your membership and take up the opportunities that we have. It's always a good event and an opportunity to network too. This has been held on the 21st of May, Friday, 9:30 till 10:30. And then the Chamber's next Chamber chat and coffee catch up is taking place on Zoom on 28th of May, 11 till 12. Just an opportunity to catch up with some members, join, have discussions about any particular topics that you might wish, and just touch base. And then finally, the virtual speed networking is taking place on Monday, the 7th of June, a very popular event, 11:30 to 12:30. We continue to do that virtually, and really useful opportunity to touch base with a number of people very quickly. And finally, I'd like to just mention that we have our business awards coming back this year in 2021. We weren't able to run it last year for very, very obvious reasons. And this year we're holding it at Reseed College on November the 19th. More, just to keep an eye out for more information that will be coming through. And apologies for my dog, who obviously has got something to say. So hopefully you may want to enter or get involved, or you know people that you'd like to nominate. And you can find more of these events and information on the portal as we go. So thanks again for attending. Thank you again to Kate and Simon for support and your presentations today. And that's all we've got for today. Any queries that you have, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So thank you again, and I hope you have a great day, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Okay, thank you.